If you've seen part 1 of this series, then you'll be aware that I said that I think the Bible contains a flat earth, a solid sky dome, and a watery chaos dragon. Yet I don't find this at all problematic for the Christian who accepts modern science. Now, that was kind of an important statement, but I didn't really do much to explain myself, as I even admitted myself in that video. So that's why I'm making this video, as if I tried to combine the material here into the first part, this would have been very difficult and very long. Now, just to be clear, the view I hold is actually held by Michael Jones, John Walton, Michael Heiser, Ben Stanhope, and many other conservative evangelical Christians, and all of them use different analogies to explain their point of view, which, at the end of the day, are pretty much the same. So, for the sake of simplicity, I will not attempt to show you all the various analogies that can be used, but instead only use one. Now, imagine, if you will, that you had a time machine, and you realize that by helping an ancient nation win a war, that this will cause a chain of events that will result in the future being much better for humanity than it already is. You go back in time and tell them what to do to win. But what you don't do with them is explain heliocentrism, the theory of evolution, gravity, or any other modern scientific facts. I mean, I suppose you could, but that would distract from the point. Imagine telling someone that grew up in a culture where everyone believed the sky was a solid dome that held back a cosmic ocean that this was just completely false. This would distract from any battle plans to win this war, as you've just shattered one of their most basic beliefs that an ancient person has about the world. This is why I don't think the Bible contains previously unknown scientific breakthroughs for the ancient world, because God was never trying to do this. God could have given Moses a 12-hour lecture on quantum mechanics on Mount Sinai, but that was never the goal. God is almost always working to do something whenever it appears in the biblical text, and if he just told the ancient Israelites that their most basic understanding of the shape of the earth, the sky, the ocean, what is beneath the ground, and so on and so forth is completely wrong, then any attempt to give commands or rules on how the people should live or what they should do would have been distracted by these factors. But also think about the subject from what science is. Science isn't static, it's dynamic. As time goes on and we learn more things, the way we understand certain scientific ideas changes. If God wrote in the accurate science for 2022 in the Bible, then that would be severely outdated by the year 3022. Of course, God could make all the scientific facts true as they would be understood at the end of time, but if that's the case, then we're back at square one, as the Bible's information wouldn't line up with science until thousands and thousands of years later. And that's assuming that that's the short end of the stick, when there could be hundreds of more thousands of years, if not millions, before the actual end of time. And by the time we do get to the end, how useful is that scientific information going to be, considering, well, it's the end of time? I think you can see why I don't think the Bible contains scientific material. God was working with an ancient culture, and so he met them where they already were, because he had something much more important to tell them. But even if what I'm saying is the case, what evidence is there within the Bible to indicate that any of this is what the ancient authors thought? Well, there's quite a lot of it actually, in various verses and passages that show the things I'm talking about. So I think it would be best if we went through some of them, all with the lens of understanding that God wasn't trying to start a scientific revolution in ancient Israel, and see how the ancient people thought about the world and how it worked. One of the most ubiquitous ancient ideas on how the world worked was the belief in a solid sky dome that held back cosmic waters. Although there are mentions of the firmament in the Bible, most Christians try to reinterpret it. But if we want to be honest with the text, we have to read the verses and look at them through the mindset of an ancient Israelite. The first and perhaps most well-known version of the firmament is mentioned in Genesis 1, 6-8. Now, think about this verse from the mindset of an ancient Israelite for just a minute. I talked about the widespread belief in the primordial waters in part 1, so that is an important part of our understanding. At first, there is nothing but water. Then God creates the firmament in the midst of the waters. This firmament separates the waters into two areas, the waters above and the waters below, above being the sky and below being the seas. When we look at passages like these from the perspective of an ancient Israelite, they tend to make a lot more sense, and this idea has further biblical attestation in Psalm 148 verses 4-6, where it talks about the waters above in reference to heaven. In Genesis chapter 7 verse 11, during the flood account, there is a mention of the windows of heaven, which is used as the way in which the earth is flooded. But, as no surprise to me, or probably you at this point, the Israelites weren't the only ones with this sort of mindset. The Egyptians believed in this concept, and they referred to the waters above frequently. One hymn specifically calls them the Nile in heaven, and other texts call them the cool or upper waters of Horus, who is the sky god in Egyptian mythology. The Egyptians also talked about how the sky was upheld and that mountain ranges on the east and west side of the Nile were the supports of the heavens. The Atrahasis says the Anzu bird caused the Great Flood by tearing the sky open with its talons. When Marduk kills Tiamat in the Babylonian creation story, he uses her corpse to create the world, and the same substance used for the earth is used for the covering of the sky, which was meant to prevent the cosmic waters from escaping. Now, keep in mind that this isn't even scratching the surface of ancient Near Eastern concepts regarding the waters above and the solid sky dome. The firmament was obviously solid enough to hold back oceans of water, and that's part of the difficulty for the person who wants to reinterpret the passage, as ancient Near Eastern texts are pretty clear on the solidness of the structure. I already mentioned how the Babylonians believed that their patron god Marduk made a solid sky roof that held back the waters above from the corpse of the dragon goddess Tiamat. There's a lot more than just the Babylonians. The Egyptians believed that the sky was made out of iron as a container for the heavenly ocean. In fact, the Egyptian word for iron literally means metal of heaven. The Sumerians were very similar, as their word for tin, another metal substance, means also metal of heaven. But lest anyone think I'm solely relying on those heathen pagan texts, we find similar ideas within the Old Testament. The Hebrew noun rakia, which is translated to firmament, appears 11 times in the Old Testament and usually refers to beating, stamping, or spreading out by pounding, and is typically associated with metal. Job 37 verse 18 makes this even more explicit by comparing God spreading out of the heavens with the casting of iron. Ezekiel chapter 1 verses 22 and 23 is another similar passage, as it describes the firmament as being a crystalline substance. Phoenician, which is an ancient language similar to Hebrew, uses a word similar to rakia, which refers to metal. The ancient Hittites spoke of the cosmic separations of the water via copper cleaver. In the 3rd century BC, when the Jews translated the Old Testament into Greek, they chose to translate the Hebrew word rakia into the Greek word stereoma, which indisputably means solid or firm. This means that the ancient Jews definitely shared the concept that the firmament was a solid substance. Now, ignoring this, some have still argued that the spreading out of the sky, which it is compared to, just refers to things like clouds. The problem is that clouds spread continually on a day-to-day basis, while the metal which it is being compared to would only be spread out during the initial manufacturing process. And perhaps the more obvious point, why would clouds be compared to difficult, hard metals? Now, some Christians who don't like these concepts may object by saying that it's all symbolism or just figures of speech, like how we say the sun rises in the morning even though we don't actually mean that. But there's a problem with this which you can already see if you've looked ahead far enough. If all these other ancient cultures talked about these same concepts, were they understanding this non-literally? I think it'd be very hard to say yes, because then for things like flat Earth, this would imply that actually no ancient culture believed the Earth was flat. And you can believe that if you want, but that's some hardcore historical revisionism just to support your biblically accurate science view. Furthermore, in some of these cultures, we actually have artwork depicting a flat Earth, so we know that they didn't actually take this as some sort of metaphor or symbolism. So the only option remaining for the person who wants to think the Bible contains any scientific information is that when God put in these scientific facts, he also mixed it with ideas and phrases that every ancient person would have thought were literal and therefore ruined his own goal because nobody could distinguish the two. Of course, this all goes away if we just recognize that the Bible isn't a science book, nor is it trying to be, but for one reason or another, this just doesn't seem to be something that's on the table for some Christians. But there are other arguments against the view that ancient Israelites saw the firmament as a solid sky dome. A popular one is that the firmament was some sort of vapor canopy that allowed people to live longer. This canopy was then destroyed during the flood event, and that's why it no longer exists today, and why people don't live until 900. As a kid, this is what I was typically taught, and I'm very accustomed to this view for that reason. But unfortunately for the person who wants to defend this position, there are a myriad of problems. The first and foremost thing is that Psalm 148 mentions the waters above in a post-flood world, therefore it could not have been the case that they were destroyed during the flood. It is also difficult to rectify the vapor canopy with the descriptions of the firmament as a hard metal. For these two reasons, among a lot of others, even very popular and prominent young Earth creationist organizations such as Answers in Genesis reject the vapor canopy view. Now, another popular view is that the waters above are just rain clouds, but this view becomes very absurd when reading Genesis chapter 1 verse 7 and verse 17. In verse 7, the waters above are, well, above the firmament, of course. Now, in verse 17, on the fourth day, when God creates the sun, moon, and stars, he places them within the firmament, not above it. So, in an attempt to preserve the Bible's supposed scientific accuracy by reinterpreting the waters above to be rain clouds, the reinterpreter ends up saying that there are some sort of rain clouds geographically above the sun, moon, and stars. I don't think I have to explain the absurdity of this view any further than just explaining it, especially when taken into account that this is only being proposed to defend the Bible's scientific accuracy. But perhaps the latest and greatest model for reinterpreting the firmament is that the waters above are a shell of ice and water particles at the edge of the universe. Now, as absurd as that may sound just by hearing it, it becomes even more of a joke when we read, once again, Psalm 148, where it reads, "Praise him, you highest heavens, and you waters above the heavens." This means that ancient Jews were unknowingly singing hymns of praise towards cosmic ice particles at the edge of the universe. Keep in mind that other cultures also mention these waters above, as I've already shown. Were they thinking of cosmic ice particles too? Maybe this is just me, but I don't think that's what the text is trying to say. Now, last but not least, the most controversial of all, flat Earth. I think it's pretty simple. Every ancient culture believed the Earth was flat, and the Israelites were no different. Even if there were no explicit mentions to a flat Earth in the Bible, the other things that we've already talked about, like the waters above and the solid sky dome known as the firmament, would already lean heavily in this direction. But there are quite a few passages, and that's what I'll go over. Now, as I've made it quite clear, I don't think the Bible is trying to give us a scientific account, and therefore I have no problem using the ideas of the Israelites and thinking that God wasn't trying to give any sort of scientific breakthrough. Now, for the verses in question, Isaiah chapter 40 verse 22 is perhaps the most popular flat earth passage, and I think it's quite clear. God sits above the circle of the earth. Now, while some think that this circle is a sphere, and oddly enough think this passage supports modern science, the Hebrew word for circle here doesn't mean sphere, and is never used as such. Job chapter 26 verse 10 harkens back to creation with the mention of God inscribing a circle on the face of the waters. Proverbs chapter 8 verses 23 to 27 is very similar to Job, but even more explicit in its relation to creation. The text reads, "Ages ago I was set up, at the first, before the beginning of the earth. When there were no depths I was brought forth, when there were no springs abounding with water. Before the mountains had been shaped, before the hills, I was brought forth. Before he had made the earth with its fields, or the first of the dust in the world. When he established the heavens, I was there. When he drew a circle on the face of the deep." The text talks about a time before creation, and then proceeds to mention God's inscription of the circle on the face of the deep. This term, face of the deep, is the same one used in Genesis 1 when God is hovering above the primordial waters. Proverbs 8 couldn't have made it any clearer that the earth was flat, and I have no problems with this, and neither should any Christian attempting to be faithful to the text. It honestly surprises me how many young earth creationists will argue vehemently for the necessity of the Bible teaching a young earth, but then will certainly turn into Bill Nye the Science Guy once it's pointed out that the Bible has a flat earth. I think the only honest and reasonable thing to do is take the text consistently. If for some reason you still are going to read modern science back into the text, then you can't really do it consistently if you think it teaches young earth creationism, but not a flat earth. Now, I wasn't sure if I should give the evidence for the fact that the Bible doesn't contain modern scientific ideas, or why this doesn't bother me first. Ultimately, I decided to explain why I don't feel the need to read modern science back into an ancient text first, so that you as the viewer could read these texts through that lens first. Once we understand that the Bible isn't trying to give us some profound unknown scientific facts, we can understand why God did things the way he did. God is all-knowing and could have told them everything about science, and had that been the Bible's stated goal, then this could be a legitimate problem for inerrancy or inspiration. Similarly, if God came down to us in the 21st century to deliver some new unknown revelation, then he probably wouldn't worry about correcting our misunderstanding of things we'll later find out to be false, because that's not the point. God did have an overarching message throughout the Bible, and it wasn't to teach ancient farmers or priests about dinosaurs, geology, heliocentrism, evolutionary biology, cosmology, or global geography. And when modern Christians try to reinterpret the text to mean these things, they may unintentionally devalue the scripture by making them something that they were never meant to be.